Thank you for joining us for Margin Notes from the Central Church of Christ in Paducah, Kentucky. If this is the first time you have watched these videos, just let me make the couple usual disclaimers. One is that these are not meant to be a deep Bible study. These are just notes from the margin of my Bible that I think you might find helpful as well. And I encourage you to write them down somewhere else, maybe a notepad or something, or evaluate them, study them, and see if there's something you'd like to add to your Bible or to just some other materials you keep from time to time. And also, as you see on the screens, these notes will cover Genesis chapters 42 through 46. Which implies, yes, we are going through the book of Genesis, and yes, we're almost done, but there are several videos, I believe 9 or 10 videos before this on the book of Genesis, and you might want to go through and watch those. There are somewhere around 100 notes. We've given 90 plus notes anyway we've given on the book of Genesis so far, and several in this section, not all that many, so this video may be a bit shorter. We hope you find what we do share with you to be encouraging. The first note comes from Genesis 42 and verse 6. This is when Joseph's brothers come to Egypt, and of course he is the grand vizier. He's set over all the land of Egypt. And Genesis 42:6 states, "Now Joseph was governor over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came, and here's the phrase, bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground." If you've never marked this in your Bible, it is worth marking that, of course, this is the fulfillment of Genesis chapter 37, verses 5 through 11, where Joseph had had those dreams at the age of about 17, where he had said that 11 stalks of grain or sheaves of grain would bow down, and then sun, moon, 11 stars. Now, this is just the star part of it because his parents aren't there yet. But the fact that his brothers bowed down before him is a fulfillment of that dream that Joseph had quite a bit earlier in his life at the age of 17. So that's one of those that we read it, we kind of know it's there, but I like to have it marked just to remind myself that's where it happens, that dream is fulfilled by his brothers coming to Egypt through this just unreal set of circumstances, and they bow down before him. He's now the grand vizier, the governor of the land of Egypt. All right, the next note, also from Genesis chapter 42, is in verse 9, where Joseph, the verse begins by saying he remembered the dreams, that he had dreamed of them. And he said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land." Now, this is one of those where I have a note where it says possibly, because we can't necessarily know what Joseph had in mind specifically, except just he could have just meant, hey, maybe you just came to see how bad the famine is here and that sort of thing. But one commentator specifically, and a couple others I looked at, made this note that I found very interesting, partially because of the direction from which Joseph's brothers would have traveled to Egypt. Most likely they would have come into Egypt through sort of the east, and specifically more the northeastern side of Egypt. So here's what I have. That this was a possible reference, the nakedness of the land, to the northeastern frontier, which the Egyptians kept very lightly defended. It often had spies. It was the most commonly invaded section of Egypt. And so Joseph may have been using a very specific common occurrence, that part of the land, the northeastern frontier of Egypt, was naked. It was undefended, or very lightly defended anyway, and very commonly had spies in it. Was even very commonly attacked because of the lack of fortification there, as it was more fortified as you came into the main part of Egypt, of course, closer to the Nile River and all of that. So that may be more specifically what Joseph is using, is you're just like all these other people who come into that part of the land to see the part that we don't have defended all that well. It's naked compared to this part that's just covered with armies and people and so on and so forth. So just an interesting thought as to what Joseph might have had in mind, or at least had used to begin to question his brothers about some things. Genesis 42 and verse 21. I love this one because it is so human. I want to begin reading all the way back up in verse 18, just to remind ourselves of what's going on in this part of the chapter. On the third day, this is the third day after the brothers come to Joseph and so forth. On the third day Joseph said to them, "Do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers remain confined where you are in custody, and let the rest go and carry grain for the famine to your households, and bring your youngest brother to me. So your words will be verified, and you shall not die." And they did so. Then they said to one another, "In truth we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul, when he begged us and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us." Now, in the margin of my Bible, beside verse 21, I just have the word guilt. But then beside this specific phrase, when he begged us, I have this written. That's a detail not found back in Genesis chapter 37. Now, not saying it didn't happen. Of course it happened. You would think it happened, but we don't know. Because Genesis 37, where they throw Joseph into the pit and all that sort of stuff, it doesn't say in the chapter that he begged to get out. But now they remember it, or they make it up. I think they remember it. And it just shows their nagging conscience, the nagging conscience of their guilt for what they had done a long time earlier now. That detail does not come out until, 5 or 6 chapters later, and of course as the time frame goes, several years later, that they bring out, hey, this is because of when we threw him in there, and he begged us, and we wouldn't listen. And so again, beside the whole verse, I have the word guilt, and then I have this phrase boxed in, which would be this, not this, and out beside I have written a detail not found in chapter 37, and it shows their nagging conscience. It's a very human verse, is it not? Genesis chapter 42, verse 24. This is the first of a couple of times where Joseph will weep in the presence of his brothers, or he'll leave the presence of his brothers, I should say, to weep. After they had talked about about him begging, verse 22, Reuben said, "Did I not tell you not to sin against the boy?" Which, by the way, is another human verse. But you did not listen, so now here comes a reckoning for his blood. They did not know that Joseph understood them, for there was an interpreter between them, and he turned away from them and wept. Why was he weeping? It's very possibly because this was the first time he learned that Reuben had tried to save his life. More than likely, Joseph didn't know that until Reuben here says, "Did I not try to tell you not to do this?" It's also possible Joseph just weeps because his brothers are there, or because they're still arguing, but this is the first time Joseph has learned that little detail. And the fact that one of his brothers had stood up for him all those years earlier, at least to some degree, is possibly what what causes him to weep in this moment of great tense emotion here in Egypt all these years later. All right, Genesis chapter 43. There are several from chapter 42, but we'll move more rapidly now. Genesis 43 and verse 8. This is when the brothers are going to go back to Egypt. And Judah, in verse, it tells their father in verse 3 that this man, talking about Joseph, said, "You're not going to see my face till you see your brother, till you bring your brother again." Right? Now, they have this back and forth about whether or not to take Benjamin with him. But notice what Judah says in verse 8. Judah said to Israel his father, "Send the boy with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and you and also our little ones." Now, why did he call him a boy? I believe it's because this is a term of endearment since Benjamin was the youngest. This was Israel's boy. Benjamin was likely, as you see on the screen, somewhere between 20 and 25 years old this time. He's not a boy, but he's Israel's boy. And so he's using a term of endearment more than likely to describe how Israel would have thought of his son. This is still my boy. And so Judah uses that terminology, that term of endearment, to describe Benjamin as a boy, even though he's every bit a grown man at this point in time. He is the youngest, but the youngest at this point ain't so young anymore in Genesis 43 and verse 8. Genesis chapter 44. This is the note, by the way. I should have had a blank screen. I forgot it. But do you remember how Joseph has his servant put a cup in the brother's bag, one of the bags, excuse me. But in verse 6, the servant overtakes the brothers and begin this search and all of that. I think it's very interesting, the servant, what he does. Because the brothers say in verse 9, "Whichever your servants is found with it shall die, and we will also be my Lord's servants." Because they just know this cup isn't there. But then look at what the servant says in verse 10. The servant said, "Let it be as you say, he who is found with it shall be my servant, the rest of you shall be innocent." That's not what they said. They said the one in whose bag it is will die, and the rest will be your servant. And he says, "It's as you say, you'll be my servant." The note I have is the servant changes the wording to save their lives because he knew the cup was there. He wasn't going to let one of them die in this situation. So he changes their own wording, their own sort of promise, in order to save a life. And it shows the heart of this servant Maybe it shows a little bit the heart of Joseph, possibly through this servant, but for sure shows the heart of the servant. May it be as you say. It's not what they said at all, but he does that to save a life because he knows he put the cup in there, so he knows exactly where it's at. Genesis. Why do I keep repeating slides? Genesis 45 and verse 5. As Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, one of the most tender moments in the entire book of Genesis. Beginning in verse 4, Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." They came near, and he said, "I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." The last phrase is the one I have a note by. That God sent me before you to preserve life. And the note is this, that Joseph recognized God's hand not just in miracles, but in the unfolding events of time. I think sometimes, especially in the Old Testament, we only recognize God's hand when a miracle happens, the crossing of the Red Sea, or manna in the wilderness, or creation, or those sorts of things. Joseph, though, looked back over his life and said, this was God's doing. He recognized God's hand not just in miracles. In fact, in the whole Joseph account, there's not a miracle to be found. It is all the providence and the working of God, as we sometimes say, behind the scenes. And Joseph recognizes that, and Joseph acknowledges that God's hand is seen not just in miracles, but God's hand is also seen in just events that unfold over time, the passing of time. And so that's a powerful note that Joseph recognizes in what had to be just an exceptionally emotional moment in a series of emotional ups and downs, that it was God's hand leading it all along all the time, including when Joseph had been sold into slavery by his brothers. Genesis 45 and verse 10 makes reference to this place called Goshen. This is where Israel's family, will come to Egypt. They will settle. This is the land that Joseph recommends for them. But where is it? Why would that be the land? Well, verse 10 says, "You will dwell in the land of Goshen. You shall be near me." That's one reason why he chose it. And he says, and you and your children, your children's children, your flocks, your herds, all that you have, which may be a reference as to why. Because they had flocks and those sorts of things. Now, the place, if you want to write, there's kind of two notes here. One is just more specifically, this is in northeast Egypt, between the modern-day places of Port Said and Suez. You may not care about that, but at least we know kind of it's that portion of Egypt. You can kind of find, at least generally on a map, which part of Egypt it is in or would have been in. But the second part of that you may really want to make note of, because throughout this section it's called the best of the land of Egypt. Well, it's not the best part of the land of Egypt for growing crops. If you want to grow great wheat crops or those sorts of things, it's not the best part of Egypt. But it is the best part of Egypt for grazing animals. That's what Israel's family and descendants were shepherds. They had herds and flocks. So they got the best of the land that fit what they did. So kind of two notes there. You may want to pick and choose kind of the more specific geographical notation, or the fact that this would have been just the perfect land for what they did as people for their occupation in Egypt, and had been doing before, of course. One more note, I believe this is the last one, from Genesis chapter 46. Yeah, this is the last one. And it is a reference to a chariot. Genesis 46, verse 28. He had sent Judah ahead of him, to Joseph to show the way before him in Goshen. They came to the land of Goshen. Then Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to meet Israel's father in Goshen. Now, Joseph, of course, works for Egypt. He's the grand vizier of Egypt. But notice it specifically says he prepared his chariot. The Egyptians didn't have chariots by then. Oh, yes, they did. This is a place that shows us biblical accuracy, because secular history confirms that chariots were introduced to Egypt just before this period of famine. Some invaders came to Egypt just before this famine period, actually introduced horses and chariots, but the reference here specifically is to chariots. And the Egyptians sort of got wind of this new technology, began to use it. So here's Joseph using what would have, for that day and time, been a new technology, and history confirms that's just about right as far as when it would have been introduced into the land of Egypt and used by the Egyptians So just another note of Bible. The Bible's always accurate, but sometimes you find these where people go, wait a minute, the Egyptians didn't have chariots back then. Yeah, they did. Secular history tells us that, perfectly. That's when chariots came into use in the land of Egypt. So several notes there. We've got one more video for you on the book of Genesis. That should be released, Lord willing, on June the 10th. We hope you'll be looking to that. And I'll tell you at the end of that video what we plan on doing following Genesis, going through the notes on Genesis. We hope all of these encourage as you study God's Word, this great first book of the Bible. And as always, we hope these videos encourage you to read the Bible, study the Bible, and live the Bible. Thanks for watching.